What just happened in Congress didn't come out of nowhere, and it wasn't an accident. This was deliberate, calculated, and designed to sound boring enough that most people wouldn't notice until it was already done. Instead of standing on the floor and announcing a ban, instead of triggering public outrage with dramatic language, lawmakers took a quieter route. They went straight for the tax code, straight for the regulatory machinery, and straight for the process that most people already find confusing and intimidating. That's how you know this is serious. When power wants to move fast without resistance, it hides behind paperwork. For decades, suppressors and short-barreled rifles existed in a strange legal space. They weren't illegal, but they weren't treated like ordinary property either. They came with taxes, long waits, registrations, and layers of approval that turned a constitutional question into a compliance obstacle course. And for a long time, that system moved slowly, painfully slowly, months, sometimes years. That slowness wasn't a bug, it was the feature. It discouraged participation without openly outlawing anything. But what Congress just did was take that old system and flip the switch from passive deterrence to active crackdown. This isn't about public safety in the way it's being sold. If it were, we'd be having an honest conversation about misuse, enforcement failures, or violent crime trends. Instead, the focus is on taxes, penalties, definitions, and administrative power. That tells you the real objective. By increasing the financial burden, tightening technical definitions, and expanding enforcement authority, the goal becomes clear: make legal ownership so expensive, so risky, and so stressful that fewer people even attempt it. Rights don't have to be repealed if they can be priced out of reach. Think about how this plays out in the real world. A working-class owner who followed every rule suddenly faces higher taxes, stricter compliance deadlines, and harsher penalties for paperwork errors. Nothing about their behavior changes, but the consequences do. What was once a manageable process becomes a legal minefield. One missed update, one misunderstood rule, one delay caused by the system itself, and now you're not just out of compliance, you're exposed. That's not accidental, that's how pressure is applied without sending agents door to door. This is also about precedent. Once Congress proves it can effectively regulate something into near extinction through taxation and bureaucracy, that tool doesn't stay confined to one category. Today it's suppressors and SBRs. Tomorrow it's something else. The mechanism is what matters. If the government can transform a lawful item into a liability simply by rewriting the tax and enforcement structure, then legality becomes conditional, temporary, and fragile. Ownership stops being a right and starts being a privilege granted at the speed and cost the government chooses. And let's be honest about who this actually affects. Criminals don't register, they don't pay taxes, they don't wait for approval. Every new layer of tax and regulation lands squarely on people who are already trying to comply. The message being sent is clear: compliance will not protect you from future crackdowns. Playing by the rules doesn't secure your position. It just keeps you on a list that can be reinterpreted later. That realization alone should make everyone pause. There's also a psychological component here that can't be ignored. Complexity creates fear. Fear creates hesitation. Hesitation reduces participation. When laws become so dense that even attorneys debate their meaning, ordinary people opt out. They sell, they surrender, or they never enter the system at all. That's how numbers shrink quietly, not with sirens, not with raids, but with silence and resignation. And once the ownership base shrinks, it becomes politically easier to go even further. What makes this moment different is the speed. Traditionally, these changes crept along through rulemaking and agency interpretation. This time, Congress accelerated the process and handed enforcement more teeth. That signals urgency on their side. It suggests they're racing ahead of something: public awareness, court challenges, or shifting political winds. When power moves quickly, it's because it knows the window won't stay open forever. This isn't about one bill or one vote. It's about a strategy that's been refining itself for years. Avoid the cultural fight. Avoid the constitutional debate. Use taxes. Use compliance. Use time. Use fear of making a mistake. That strategy only works if people underestimate it. And that's why this moment matters. Because once the system is tightened, rolling it back becomes exponentially harder. Now here's the part that should make everyone stop scrolling and actually listen, because the registry freeze isn't some technical footnote buried in legal language, it's the point of no return. When people hear freeze, they think temporary, they think pause, they think this can be sorted out later. That assumption is exactly what this system depends on. In reality, registry freezes don't work like weather delays. They work like doors locking behind you. Once they're shut, they don't reopen quietly, and they almost never reopen at all. A registry freeze doesn't just stop new entries. It redraws the line between who is considered lawful and who is suddenly outside the system. If you're in for now. If you're out permanently. No late filings, no grace period, no explanation about delays, confusion, or backlogs caused by the very agency running the registry. The system doesn't care why you missed the window. It only cares whether your name was there when the clock stopped. And history matters here. Every time a registry has been frozen, the same pattern follows. First comes the reassurance. Nothing will change for current owners. Then comes the reinterpretation. Updated rules, expanded definitions, new compliance checks. Then comes enforcement, audits, and retroactive scrutiny. Not overnight, not loudly, but methodically. The freeze creates a static list, and static lists are easy to analyze, crosser, efference, and act on. That's not speculation. That's how bureaucratic systems function. What makes this moment especially dangerous is the false sense of safety it creates. People think, I already own one, I'm fine, or I'll deal with this later, or they wouldn't. Go after people who followed the rules. But freezes are never about protecting those who complied. They're about controlling growth and limiting future participation. Once no new entries are allowed, the ownership population begins to shrink naturally through sales, transfers, deaths, and fear-driven surrender. Over time, the category becomes politically isolated, numerically small, and easier to target. And let's talk about timing, because timing is everything here. Registry freezes don't happen randomly. They happen when lawmakers believe resistance will be minimal, confusion will be high, and attention will be divided. The goal is to compress decision-making into a narrow window where people hesitate just long enough to miss it. That hesitation becomes permanent exclusion. The system isn't forgiving, and it isn't designed to be. There's also a chilling effect that kicks in immediately. Once a freeze is announced or even rumored, uncertainty explodes. People don't know whether to buy, sell, transfer, or hold. Dealers hesitate. Attorneys argue over interpretations. Agencies issue vague guidance that raises more questions than it answers. That chaos isn't a side effect, it's a feature. Confusion slows action, and slowed action benefits the freeze. And here's the uncomfortable truth that rarely gets said out loud. Registries don't just track objects, they track people. Once frozen, the registry becomes a fixed snapshot of ownership that can be revisited again and again under new rules. What was legal under one interpretation can be questioned under another. Compliance becomes a moving target, and the burden is always on the individual to prove innocence rather than on the system to prove wrongdoing. That's a powerful shift, and it only works once the registry stops changing. Some will argue that freezes are meant to stabilize the system or allow agencies to catch up. That argument falls apart the moment you look at outcomes. Stabilization never leads to liberalization. Catching up never leads to expanded access. Freezes only move in one direction, and that direction is toward restriction, consolidation, and enforcement. If reopening were the goal, timelines and conditions would be clear. Instead, what we get is silence. This also creates a generational cutoff that people underestimate. Future buyers, younger citizens, and those just now becoming interested are locked out entirely. Rights that exist only for those who acted early aren't rights anymore. They're privileges granted by timing. Over time, that changes the culture, the conversation, and the political calculus. When fewer people are affected, fewer people speak up. When fewer people speak up, the next step becomes easier. And here's where the urgency becomes real. Waiting doesn't preserve your options. Waiting eliminates them. Once the freeze hits, decisions are no longer yours to make. You can't comply your way back in. You can't correct paperwork that can no longer be submitted. You can't argue intent when the system only recognizes timestamps. The freeze converts hesitation into disqualification. This isn't panic. This is pattern recognition. The registry freeze isn't the end game. It's the setup. It locks the board so future moves can be made without resistance. It turns a living system into a controlled inventory. And once that happens, everything else becomes easier for those in power and harder for everyone else.